What you're about to hear was never meant to be heard. Not because it's old, not because it's classified, but because once you hear it, you can't unknow it. During World War II, Japan didn't just fight a war, it tested one on living people, men, women, children. They weren't executed, they weren't sentenced, they were studied, opened, measured, and written down. Temperature of organs, time taken to collapse, the exact moment a human body stops resisting. And the most disturbing part, the men who did this were not criminals hiding in shadows. They were doctors, educated, decorated, and after the war, most of them walked free. No trials, no prison, no consequences. But this video is not just about what happened in a laboratory. Because when the war officially ended in 1945, for one man, it didn't end at all. While the world rebuilt, while nations signed treaties, he kept fighting, alone, for decades. Two stories. One about what humans will do to others when morality is removed, and one about what humans will do to themselves when surrender becomes impossible. This is not a history lesson. This is the war after the war. They didn't tell him where he was going. The train had no markings, no destination board, no announcement, just a long gray line of carriages moving north, deeper into territory most maps didn't bother naming. Inside the compartment, the windows were sealed shut, not boarded, sealed. Even the guards avoided looking outside. When the train finally stopped, there was no station, no platform, no civilians, only a fence. Tall, wooden, endless. Barbed wire ran along the top, not to keep people out, but to make sure no one ever climbed over from inside. A sign hung crooked near the gate, black letters on white paint. Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. It sounded harmless, administrative, boring. That was intentional. The men were ordered out one by one. No shouting, no panic. Anyone who hesitated was gently pushed forward, as if this was routine and resistance would only be embarrassing. Past the gate, the compound opened up. Low concrete buildings, smoke drifting from chimneys, a smell in the air that didn't belong to any factory. Not metal, not fuel, something organic, something wrong. They were lined up and counted. Then something strange happened. They weren't called prisoners. They weren't given numbers. Instead, a doctor walked down the line, clipboard in hand, and spoke softly to an assistant. "Logs," he said. "Not people. Logs." The word was written down carefully. From that moment on, nothing else mattered. Not names, not ages, not crimes. Logs didn't have rights. Logs didn't have families. Logs were used. The men were separated immediately. Some were taken left, others right. No explanation, no goodbyes. Those taken left were never seen again. Those taken right were given uniforms. Clean, almost new. That was the first mistake. Clean clothes make you think you'll survive. They were shown dormitories, bunks neatly arranged, blankets folded with precision, a mess hall, hot food, real food, rice, soup, meat. For a brief moment, hope crept in. Maybe this was a labor camp. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe the sign outside was real. That night, the lights stayed on, bright, white, unblinking. Sleep came in fragments, and just before dawn, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Not boots, leather shoes, measured, unhurried. A door opened, a name was called, then another, then another. No one screamed, not yet, because no one knew what the building at the end of the corridor was for. The doctors did. They had prepared the instruments hours ago. The building at the end of the corridor had no sign, no number, no label, just a thicker door, painted white, clean enough to be reassuring. Inside, the air was warmer, too warm. The smell returned, stronger now. Not decay, not blood. Something chemical, mixed with flesh. The men were told to sit, not tied, not restrained. That was deliberate. Restraints make people panic. Panic ruins data. A doctor entered. White coat, round glasses, hands already gloved. He smiled, not cruelly, politely, as if greeting patients at a clinic. An assistant read names from a clipboard. When a name was called, the man stood, walked forward, lay down on the table, still believing this was an examination, still believing there was a rule book. The first incision was made without anesthesia, not because they forgot, because pain was the point. They wanted to know how long the human body could remain conscious, how shock developed, how organs reacted when exposed to air, how long the heart kept beating when touched. The doctor spoke calmly. Notes were taken, temperatures recorded, pulse measured. When the man screamed, no one reacted. Screams were background noise, like wind outside a window. They cut slowly, not out of care, out of curiosity. Every layer mattered: skin, fat, muscle. One assistant leaned in and asked a question. "Is the subject still conscious?" The doctor nodded. "Good. Proceed." The man did not die quickly. That was another mistake people make when imagining this place. Death was inefficient. They kept victims alive as long as possible, because once a subject died, the experiment ended, and they were never wasting time. Some procedures tested disease, plague bacteria injected directly into the bloodstream, cholera poured into mouths held open by force, typhus sprayed into lungs. The doctors waited, measured fever rise, measured delirium, measured the moment speech turned to incoherent sound. Others tested cold, limbs submerged in ice water until frozen solid, then struck with a stick. If it sounded like wood, the limb was ready. Skin peeled off easily after that, like removing a glove. Still, the subject was kept alive, because the question wasn't, "Can this kill?" The question was, "How long does it take?" After each procedure, the body was not buried. Burials leave records. Instead, remains were incinerated, ashes mixed with others, names erased, no grave, no marker, as if the person had never existed. And by morning, another name was called. What happened inside the building was only the beginning, because Unit 731 was not created to kill a few hundred people quietly. It was created to answer a larger question. Can disease be turned into a weapon? Not in theory, not in a laboratory dish, but in the real world, on real populations. Once the doctors were confident their bacteria worked, they needed a testing ground. They didn't have to look far. Villages surrounded the compound. Poor, unprotected, uninformed, perfect. At night, trucks rolled out. No markings, no soldiers visible, only containers. Inside those containers were fleas. Thousands of them, each flea infected with plague bacteria. The trucks stopped near wells, near food storage areas, near homes. The containers were opened, and then the trucks drove away. No explosions, no gunfire, just silence. Days later, people began to fall sick. High fever, swollen lymph nodes, blackened skin. Families didn't understand what was happening. They thought it was a curse. Bad water, bad air. By the time they realized it was contagious, it was already too late. Entire villages collapsed in weeks. Bodies left inside homes because no one was strong enough to move them. And when survivors fled, they carried the disease with them. Back inside Unit 731, doctors waited. They recorded reports from the field. How fast symptoms appeared, how far the infection spread, how many died. When the numbers were high, there was satisfaction. Not relief, satisfaction. Because the experiment had worked, they also tested bombs, ceramic bombs, designed not to explode violently, but to shatter and release bacteria into the air. Test sites were prepared. Prisoners were tied to stakes, not to kill them instantly, but to see how infection entered the body, through lungs, through eyes, through small cuts in skin. Doctors stood at a safe distance, clipboards ready, stopwatches ticking. They weren't watching people die. They were watching data form. By the early 1940s, Unit 731 had perfected something terrifying, a way to kill thousands without ever seeing their faces. And the most dangerous part? The rest of the world had no idea, no warnings, no alarms, just unexplained outbreaks, just entire areas suddenly emptied of life. And the war was still ongoing, which meant there was one final question left to answer. What happens when defeat is coming, and secrets can't be allowed to survive? By 1944, something had changed. Not inside Unit 731, but outside it. The reports coming in were no longer confident. Supply lines were failing. Cities were being bombed. The war was no longer expanding. It was collapsing. And Hiroo Onoda understood something very clearly. If Japan lost, Unit 731 could not be allowed to exist. Not the buildings, not the documents, and certainly not the people inside. So an order was prepared, not written, not signed, spoken, and understood. The prisoners were told nothing. They never were. But one morning, routines changed. No roll call, no procedures. Instead, guards arrived with masks, gas masks. Doors were sealed, vents closed. Pellets were dropped into rooms where people were sleeping. The gas moved slowly, quietly. By the time anyone realized what was happening, there was nowhere to run. Those who survived the gas were taken outside, hands tied, kneeling. Shots were fired one by one, not hurried. Ammunition was being conserved. Bodies were stacked, then burned, not for sanitation, for erasure. The laboratories were next. Documents fed into furnaces, specimen jars smashed, organs flushed away, years of research destroyed in days. Animals were killed, equipment dismantled, buildings rigged with explosives. By the time Soviet forces began moving closer, Unit 731 was already disappearing. The compound that had consumed thousands of lives was reduced to ash and rubble, as if it had never been there. But here is the part that changes everything. Hiroo Onoda did not flee in panic. He left calmly, with briefcases. Inside them were results, charts, observations, data, everything he had learned from human experimentation. And he knew exactly where he was going, because there was another country watching the war very closely. A country that had not suffered invasion. A country already thinking about the next war. The United States. Hiroo Onoda did not surrender. He negotiated. When American forces moved into Japan, they were not just collecting weapons and prisoners. They were collecting knowledge. And Onoda knew exactly what he had. He arrived with files, not confessions, not apologies, data, years of it. Human reactions to plague, cold exposure limits, infection timelines, biological dispersal methods, information no laboratory in the world had ever legally produced. The Americans listened, and then they made a decision that would never appear in public records. No trial, no charges, no headlines. In exchange for the research, Onoda and his team would walk free. Their victims would not be named. Their crimes would not be prosecuted. And Unit 731 would officially vanish from history. The Cold War was beginning, and biological warfare mattered more than justice. Doctors who had cut open living bodies returned to civilian life. Some became professors. Some led medical associations. Some published papers. Their careers flourished. Their past did not follow them. For decades, textbooks remained silent. Courtrooms remained empty. And the war, officially, was over. But here's the problem with declaring a war finished. Not everyone hears the announcement. In 1945, on a small island in the Pacific, a Japanese intelligence officer received his last orders. They were clear. Do not surrender. Do not die. Do not believe enemy broadcasts. The war would end only when a superior officer returned. Until then, he was to keep fighting. His name was Hiroo Onoda. And while scientists were erasing evidence, while governments were burying truths, Onoda disappeared into the jungle. For the next 29 years, he would live inside a war that no longer existed. While the world entered the nuclear age, he stalked forests with a rifle. While treaties were signed, he waited for orders that would never come. Two stories. One where evil escaped punishment by becoming useful, and one where loyalty became a prison with no walls. One war hidden in laboratories, another hidden in plain sight. And both survived long after 1945. Hiroo Onoda was not lost. That's important. Lost men tried to return. Onoda stayed exactly where he was told to stay. In late 1944, he was sent to Lubang Island, a small, forest-covered island in the Philippines. His orders were unusual. He was not to charge, not to die, not to surrender. He was to observe, to sabotage enemy operations, to gather intelligence, and most importantly, to survive, no matter how long it took. The officer who briefed him was specific. You are absolutely forbidden from taking your own life. It may take 3 years. It may take 5. But whatever happens, we will come back for you. Onoda believed him. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, leaflets were dropped over the island. They said the war was over. Onoda read them and dismissed them immediately, because surrender leaflets were a known tactic. Psychological warfare. Lies designed to draw soldiers out. Radio broadcasts followed, newspapers, photos. Onoda examined everything carefully. Too carefully. There were inconsistencies, paper quality, language choices, details that felt wrong. To Onoda, this didn't look like peace. It looked like deception. And deception meant the enemy was still active. So Onoda stayed hidden. At first, he wasn't alone. 3 other soldiers remained with him. They built shelters from leaves, stole rice from local farms, avoided roads, avoided people. They fired warning shots when approached. To the villagers, they were ghosts. To Onoda, they were still at war. Years passed. 1 soldier surrendered. Another was killed in a firefight with police. By 1972, Onoda was alone, still armed, still in uniform, still following orders issued before most of the world's population had been born. He continued to patrol. He continued to mark dates. He continued to believe rescue was coming. And here is the unsettling part. Onoda did not think he was insane. He thought he was disciplined, because discipline meant obedience, and obedience meant honor, even if it took decades. By the late 1940s, Lubang Island had changed. New roads, new farms, children born after the war. But in the forest, nothing had changed. Hiroo Onoda still woke before sunrise, still cleaned his rifle, still counted ammunition, still scanned the tree line for movement. To him, every farmer was a scout. Every patrol was an advance unit. Every sound was hostile. The first killing happened quietly. A villager approached too close. Onoda believed he was being tracked. He fired, One shot, then disappeared into the jungle. The island authorities called it an accident. They didn't know what they were dealing with. Over the years, more incidents followed. Fields burned at night, shots fired at police patrols, farmers killed while harvesting rice. The victims had names, families, lives that existed completely outside Onoda's war. To him, they were not civilians. They were enemy collaborators. Leaflets continued to fall from the sky, this time with photographs, family letters, messages signed by former commanders. Onoda examined them carefully and rejected them. Why? Because they didn't come through the chain of command. The order to surrender could only come from one man, the officer who had sent him to Lubang. And until that happened, the mission continued. By the early 1970s, Onoda had killed and wounded dozens. The world knew his name. Newspapers called him a relic, a curiosity, a living fossil of a finished war. But Onoda didn't read newspapers. He read terrain. Then, something unexpected happened. Not an ambush, not a firefight. A man entered the jungle alone, unarmed, calling Onoda's name. He was not a soldier. He was not a policeman. He was a civilian, and he had come looking for a ghost. The man's name was Norio Suzuki. He was not sent by the government, not by the military, not by police. He came on his own. Suzuki later said he was searching for three things: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. He found only one of them. Suzuki didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't carry a weapon. He stood at the edge of the forest and spoke calmly, like someone talking to an old friend. "Onoda-san," he said, "the war ended a long time ago." Onoda emerged slowly, rifle in hand, uniform faded but intact, posture rigid. They talked for hours. Suzuki showed him newspapers, photographs, proof of a world Onoda had never entered. Onoda listened, politely, carefully, and then he said something that stunned Suzuki. "I will not surrender," Onoda said, "unless I receive orders from my commanding officer. Not the emperor, not the government. One man." Suzuki left and returned weeks later. This time, he brought the officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, older, civilian clothes, no authority left except memory. They stood facing each other in the jungle. Taniguchi read the order aloud, formal, clear. All combat activity is to cease immediately. For the first time in 29 years, Onoda lowered his rifle. He didn't cry, he didn't collapse. He stood still, as if waiting for the next instruction. Then something subtle happened. The war ended, not in celebration, not in relief, but in silence. Onoda surrendered in 1974. He handed over his rifle, still functioning, ammunition intact. He bowed and stepped into a world that had moved on without him. Back in Japan, he was welcomed as a hero. No charges, no trial, just applause, just like the doctors of Unit 731. Different crimes, same result. One group said they were following science. One man said he was following orders. Both were believed. Both were forgiven. And both left behind victims whose names were never fully recorded.